Hi, folks. This is a pre-recorded mock presentation suitable for one model for your own presentations, which are to be uploaded to unlisted YouTube for your colleagues' reference prior to Thanksgiving. I will be giving this presentation in a semi-formal fashion, and so I want to make a few provisos, provide myself a few provisos. The first is that I may not run exactly to time, although I am going to try to demonstrate best practices in terms of running on time and of monitoring the pace at which I'm moving through my materials. The second is that I don't have a fully written text on this particular topic because I am trying to kill two birds with one stone and both give you a mock presentation and also provide new material that is in the right place in our course sequence. So those two provisos, but I hope that this will nevertheless be useful for you. Best practices number one, I'm going to time myself. I'm going to have a timer running off screen so that I have an idea of where I am in my presentation. Excuse me. Ordinarily, in a conference setting, the chair of the committee, the chair of the panel would be monitoring that. But as I have suggested to you, practicing a pre-authored and carefully edited reading text and learning to deliver it in a fashion which feels organic and spontaneous is the best way to arrive at the best, most accessible, most precise, most efficient writing style, which moves through the material in a timely fashion while still providing maximum comprehension for your audience. And it's also a way to practice staying within the time limits. So the typical conference presentation is a 20-minute presentation followed by 10 minutes of Q&A. Sometimes the chair of a panel will give you a minute or 2 minutes grace period. But generally speaking, you're trying to hit that sweet spot between about 18 minutes and 19 minutes and 50 seconds. So that's going to be my best effort. Although, as I say, I'm giving myself a couple of provisos. There's no formally authored text, although I'll try to spontaneously compose a text in a fashion that I think works. And secondly, I may run just a bit loose in terms of time because I'm trying to move through all of this material, which is pertinent to the work that we're doing. So here I go with my timer. Hello, and thank you for this opportunity to speak to you on the topic which you see on your screen. My presentation today is entitled Charles Ives and the Boston Classicists. It's an examination of the career influences and career divergences between the American composer Charles Ives, who was born in 1874, and the group of composers who are loosely described as the Boston Classicists or the Second New England School. My thesis is that although these two groups are conventionally distinguished from one another because of both career profile and compositional outputs, both Charles Ives, who is widely regarded as a patron figure, even a father figure of American modernism, and the Boston Classicists, in fact, represent two manifestations of a particularly Anglo-German and Eurocentric vision of American music. The Boston Classicists were a musical movement which centered in the academic world of Boston and New York, and they moved freely between university academic settings and other kinds of essentially upwardly mobile, culturally aspirational musical employments, particularly in Protestant church denominations. They also came from a fairly homogeneous cultural and aesthetic background. In other words, they came from a certain social class, ethnicity, cultural, and very importantly, educational experience. A few composers who were conventionally grouped in this school, which is sometimes also referred to as the Second New England School, to distinguish them from the First New England School of New England composers in the 18th century who were primarily composers, self-taught and working in the idiom of psalm settings, people like William Billings and Daniel Reed. This Second New England School, these Boston Classicists, include some of the following composers, and I'm also including samples of the titles of pieces which are in some way exemplary, not just of their topics, but really of their aesthetic and what they understood themselves to be doing. George W. Chadwick, who was born in 1854, Many of these composers were trained in Europe, and Chadwick is no exception. They came from a social class that made it possible for them to receive music training in Europe. And the reason that that was so important was because at the time that these composers were developing as young academics, college age students, there were no formal composition programs in North America. In fact, this group of the Boston Classicists, after training in Europe, would be movers in the first institution of composition departments in American universities. And I'll say a bit more about the presence of music study in North American universities prior to this generation, and also how they impacted and changed the nature of music study in universities. So Chadwick, working in an essentially Anglo-German idiom with the concert overture, very much a late 19th century sort of symphonic poem, programmatic work called Adonais. I'd also just like to mention a personal favorite, which is his burlesque opera, almost an operetta called Tabasco, which is interestingly set on the Lower East Side of New York at a time when the Lower East Side of New York was an immensely culturally diverse immigrant neighborhood and had been for at least 100 years. So Tabasco is almost a pageant of contrasted ethnic portrayals in both stage personae and also in terms of the music styles. So Chadwick has this other side, although he is very aspirational kind of symphonic composer with Adonais from 1895. From 1894, the burlesque operetta called Tabasco is well worth your investigation. Edward MacDowell is in some ways a kind of quintessential member of the Boston Classicists. He was a pianist, also trained in Europe, in Germany, in fact, and taught at the New England Conservatory and also taught in New York as well. His particular area of compositional output tends to be bifurcated. He composed extensively small characteristic pieces for the piano, what we would call character pieces, pieces which have programmatic titles and are small in scope and evocative of a certain kind of late romantic kind of aesthetic. But also he's very heavily influenced by what was at that time called Indian music. MacDowell was not knowledgeable about the music of indigenous Americans, and his music now, 120 years later, sounds rather disjunct and even rather appropriative or exoticist to us. But MacDowell, like a number of other composers, and in fact, like literary people of the period, people like Nathaniel Hawthorne and James Fenimore Cooper, was very interested in the idea that an American nationalist idiom, in his case in music, might be derived not so much from the music of indigenous Native Americans, but from the idealized images. And so he wrote tone poems about Hiawatha, which was in fact a poem by James Fenimore Cooper, and also a series of works for the piano, including the second suite from 1897, the so-called Indian Suite. Daniel Gregory Mason, who is a generation younger than Chadwick and continues the nationalist connections of these Boston classicists into the post-World War I period. And as an exemplar, I've given you the Symphony No. 3, which he subtitled Lincoln. And then finally, Amy Beach, Mrs. H.H.A. Beach, who was also of a particular social and economic class in New England. Because she was female, she did not have the opportunity to study in Europe, particularly in Germany, prior to the First World War, as so many of these composers did. We've encountered her previously in the medium of her debates with Antonin Dvorak regarding exactly what the sources of an American national symphonic school should be. An under-recognized composer, historically now receiving something of a resurgence. She did eventually travel and concertize as a piano soloist and occasionally as a conductor in Europe after the death of her husband. But during this period, the period prior to the First World War, when these music programs were being founded, Amy Beach was essentially not able, because of her gender, to be so much of a leader in shaping American classical music aesthetics. John Knowles Paine, on the other hand, was quite influential because he was the founder of the composition department at Harvard University. And in fact, there is a concert hall on the campus of Harvard University, which is called Paine Hall. And as we can see here, he's likewise a composer working in late 19th century, primarily Anglo-German symphonic forms, the concert overture and the symphony, but also drawing upon programmatic topics like the theatrical characterizations of Shakespeare. And then finally, and perhaps most pertinently to Charles Ives Horatio Parker, whose dates you see there, Parker was also trained in Germany. He was also very much a Eurocentric, and we could even say Germanophile composer, so much as so many of these composers were. His first major piece, the piece that sort of signaled his arrival as an influential and well-known composer in North America, was a cantata called Hora Novissima, which is a secular cantata from 1893. And it shows allegiance to the Anglo-German tradition as well. I should say again that so many of these composers were trained in Europe, both because North American concert art aesthetics were being shaped by German philosophical and aesthetic ideas, and also because it was not possible to receive a formal training in composition in a university in North America until these very individuals came back from Europe and established that training themselves. Parker intersects particularly directly with Charles Ives because he was the founder of the composition department at Yale University, which Ives attended in the late 1880s. And just to reiterate, these composers very much consider themselves the inheritors of the academic tradition, the academic compositional, particularly symphonic tradition of Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert. They are not particularly interested in, nor are they particularly influenced by the music of the German modernists, people like Liszt and subsequently Mahler. They are much more interested in the classical forms and in the sort of formal academic technical rigor of that tradition, which we know was equally influential toward German-born composers in the same period. So in North American art music composition in the period of the 1880s and 1890s, and indeed almost up to the First World War, the predominant compositional influence and school is an Anglo-German school. I should also mention the influence of a non-musician, John Sullivan Dwight, who founded a weekly newspaper on the topic of music called the Journal of Music in 1859 and ran it for quite some number of years. Dwight was an anti-Wagnerian, that is, he was opposed to the cult of Wagner. He regarded Wagner as a misfire or a detour away from the tradition of Anglo-German music. And in fact, he was a supporter of, in opposition to Wagner, he was a supporter of the tradition of these same composers, Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert, and quintessentially Brahms. Dwight considered himself one of the great advocates for the performance of Beethoven's symphonic works in North America, and his allegiance and his advocacy in this very widely distributed newspaper, which aggregated newspaper reports and concert reviews and news and public events about music from all over Europe from correspondents, published in this weekly journal, Dwight's Journal of Music. Daniel Gregory Mason himself, who, as we said, was one of the later composers who carried this tradition into the 1930s, once very famously framed the motto, "Thank God Wagner is dead and Brahms is alive." Now, of course, what Mason meant was that they were both dead, but that in his opinion, in the opinion of Mason and the members of the Boston Classicists and of John Sullivan Dwight, the core rigorous artistic compositional tradition, which should be emulated by American composers, American-born composers seeking to establish a national school of American symphonic music, was the tradition of Brahms out of Schubert and Beethoven. Wagner was regarded as experimental and really unrigorous, and we could even say disreputable. And this is still just within the German tradition. We are not even taking into account the kinds of perspectives that these same Boston classicists might have had on composers who were from outside the German orbit. Another quote from Mason, which is relevant here, is he said, quote, "Our whole view of music is based on the style of classic and romantic symphonists, beginning with Haydn and Mozart and ending with Mendelssohn and Schumann. Even Bach was rather on the edge of the music that we recognize." Now, he's speaking retrospectively, but it does get to the point that in North American academic composition, amongst this particular social and ethnic class of composers born into a degree of economic privilege, male and Anglo, who had the opportunity and the wherewithal to study in Europe, what they brought back from Europe was a primarily Anglo-German, traditional, Brahmsian inheritance from European music. In North American universities, there had been a tradition of music study as part of university training, going all the way back to the foundation of Harvard University itself in the early 17th century. But music as practice, music as a profession, music composition, much less music performance, was not regarded as particularly reputable. Rather, the courses which were established at Harvard and eventually at other Ivy League schools and other schools in New England over the course of the 18th and 19th century were primarily music theoretical, or even we could say music aesthetics, music as philosophy, music as appreciation, music as part of an individual's well-rounded university education. The idea that one might attend university in order to be trained practically in music as a conductor, as a composer, much less as an instrumentalist, is a much later addition into the university curriculum. And so these individuals were well positioned because of their social class, because of their training, because of their European credibility, we could say. They were well positioned to come back to the States in the last part of the 19th century and begin to establish practical music making curricula, particularly and specifically curriculum in composition as a kind of intellectual and academic practice in the period just before 1900. As I've mentioned, there is a strong Eurocentric bias in this era and amongst these academic and economically privileged composers. Their bias prior to the First World War is primarily German, because that's where they go to study. They study especially in Berlin, because Berlin was a university city. Secondarily, and after the First World War, for reasons that may seem evident, there were some of these composers, younger composers, particularly Charles Loeffler and others, who did their training in Paris as opposed to in Germany. And when that happened, they brought back new trends from Parisian composers, Paris-based composers like Debussy, Satie, and Stravinsky. And also, interestingly, they also brought back the influence of the Paris-based composition teacher, Nadia Boulanger, who was a close friend of Stravinsky. So there is still a Eurocentrism. Pre-World War I, it's primarily German. Post-World War I, there is a shift toward a French training. But it's still the gold standard for a composer in these academic settings was training in Europe. As I've mentioned, there were reasons why these American composers who were seeking to develop a nationalist idiom, an idiom that could compete from North America with the great traditions of Europe and especially Germany, there were reasons that they went toward Native American resources, or at least Native American themes. And subsequently, in the 1930s and into the 1940s, there is a branch of these composers who become much more invested in what we would now call folklore or ethnomusicology, and they begin actually to collect and to study and to advocate on behalf of indigenous music. But prior to that time, these composers are mostly drawing programmatic ideas and rather stereotypical exoticist musical constructions from Native American music. Of course, as we've mentioned in class, there's an influence from the presence of Antonin Dvorak at the National Conservatory in New York. Dvorak, regarded as one of the great nationalist composers of Europe, had come to the National Conservatory and involved himself in the discourse around what the sources for a great North American nationalist music would be. The presumption, overriding presumption, was that it would be Eurocentric, that it would be Anglo German-centered, that it would be representative of an aspirational kind of high art, highbrow cultural cachet, and that was the appropriate sort of music to be taught in a university setting. We've spoken about these individuals' positions, the kinds of social backgrounds from which they came, and the posts that they held in university composition departments, some of them as music directors in major Protestant churches in New York and Boston. And thus they were very well positioned to have a great deal of impact simply because people listened to them and published their writings in shaping the aesthetic aspirations of what American music could be and should do. Conventionally, these composers are considered differently, distinctly from Charles E. Ives, who was born in 1874. He came from, however, a very similar kind of economic background. His father had been a Civil War bandmaster, and Ives grew up in Danbury, Connecticut. Although he did not come from money, his family was essentially a scuffling working class family. Ives made himself a millionaire involving himself from the age of around 22 after he graduated from Yale in the very early roots of the insurance business. And that is an interesting story about a particular moment in the insurance industry in which there was a great deal of idealism about the fact that life insurance and health insurance could actually protect working class families from the devastation of injury or death. Ives made himself a millionaire, and although he was very active in his early life with training from his father, practical music training in both composition and also music theory, though Ives was very active as a pianist and as a church organist, played snare drum in his father's bands, those musical experiences did not extend much past Ives's time at Yale University. He was not a particularly good student at Yale University, although it was very formative for him. Throughout his period at Yale, he continued as a church organist for several congregational churches in Connecticut and was, by all accounts, both a virtuoso keyboardist and also someone who aspired to the career of composer. He composed a cantata himself under the influence of his composition teacher, Horatio Parker. Parker had written a cantata called Hora Novissima, and Ives composed a cantata entitled The Celestial Country. And it seemed as if he was positioning himself to be a composer in an academic setting, rather like the experience of his teacher, Horatio Parker, and other members of the Boston Classicists. However, Ives experienced a degree of discontinuity in his musical life, which may have had something to do with his very strong identification with his father's experimental nature. His father died while Ives was at Yale, and Charles experienced that loss very greatly, very deeply. So Ives had a strongly experimental and modernist curiosity, kind of musical curiosity, and a very acute musical ear. And he found some difficulty in writing to order writing within the strictures of Anglo-German academic, especially contrapuntal and harmonic practice, and tussled with Horatio Parker, although Ives in his later life may have significantly exaggerated the nature and the scope of that conflict with Parker. He did therefore have a rather atypical career outline. That is to say that instead of graduating from Yale and then perhaps maintaining his church musicianship posts or seeking a university post as a composition or perhaps a music theory teacher, he abandoned that path shortly after he graduated from Yale, after The Celestial Country and some of his other aspirational works received negative reviews. Ives cut that off short and went into the insurance industry with friends of his family and made himself a millionaire. Also atypically, he continued his compositional career, but during the active period of his composition, which was from around 1893 to 1917 or 1921, the details are a little fuzzy, he sought almost no public performances. He simply went to work, ran the insurance agency, and came home and composed at nights and on weekends and on the train to and from New York. And piled up the scores in his music room. So a rather atypical career outline at a moment when the members of the Boston Classicists were themselves achieving quite a good deal of visibility and cultural influence. There's some key insights about Ives. One is that in addition to his influence from the German classicists, from the Beethoven, Schubert, Brahms tradition, he was also aware, in ways that he subsequently perhaps de-emphasized or even denied, he was also aware of the much more experimental music, both in terms of formal and harmonic practice, which were coming from Wagner and Dvorak and Debussy. In fact, Ives's first symphony, which was written while he was still at Yale University, it's very much in the tradition of Dvorak. It is a conventional multi-movement symphony, and it sounds like Dvorak. So although he subsequently de-emphasized that influence for reasons that we'll talk about. In fact, he was aware of, it's been established, he was aware of newer trends in German and Parisian composition at the time that he was completing his music studies at Yale. As I've mentioned, he was trained in keyboard and theory and in vernacular music by his father and was quite successful as a working keyboardist, particularly in a church situation, although he did clash with Horatio Parker over the experimental nature of his father's musical aesthetic. As I mentioned, he was largely isolated. That is, he was not visible amongst public composers and public music thinkers in this period, but he worked very much behind the scenes, partly because he had the money to be an advocate and a financial supporter of a number of new music initiatives on both his own behalf and behalf of other composers whose experimental music he admired. Another thing to be said about Ives is that there may be one reason that he may have been somewhat resistant to acknowledging the influence of late 19th century Parisian composers, excuse me, was because he was really very much a small town Victorian. He thought like a Victorian person. He was rather disapproving of certain kinds of social conduct, even though he was a very strong advocate for composers in his orbit like Henry Cowell and Carl Ruggles, who were gay. He was made uncomfortable by non-heteronormative life. He was actually rather uncomfortable with any kind of bohemian sensibilities. He was a small town person with a small town Victorian sensibility, but with this sort of questing musical imagination. It's an interesting dichotomy of experience. We will talk more about Ives's stylistic approach when we come to listen to some of the music in the classroom. But I just want to emphasize that in very many ways, his music, written during the active period between 1895 and 1917, was really quite experimental and quite distinctive. Polytonality, polyrhythm, polytexture, highly experimental, shifting time signatures, multiple simultaneous contrasting time signatures or tempi, multiple tonal centers, polytonality, the use of collages, almost mosaic structures, which meld many different materials, especially melodic quotation and allusion, and then cumulate at the end of a particular movement in the final statement of the theme, sort of reversing the theme in variations or the variations and then the theme. That's what Burkholder means when he describes cumulative form. Very much influenced by vernacular music, rather like Mahler. Ives had a kind of universalist, inclusive vision of all the music he'd experienced and sought a kind of modernist formal organization, formal and harmonic organization, which would let him be inclusive of all of these different, often programmatic elements. A point that's not often made about Ives, which I think is exceptionally important in understanding what he was trying to do, was that he appears to have had an absolutely phenomenal sonic memory. The capacity not only to remember how music and indeed the world had sounded in his childhood, about which he was quite nostalgic, but also the ability to capture in a score not only the literal reality of that sound in 1886 when he was 12 years old, but also the particularly sort of swirling stream of consciousness, allusive, one topic leads to another experience of musical memory, which is not the same thing as hearing a score played back in the mind's ear. Musical and sonic memory is associative and stream of consciousness, and Ives had a remarkable ability and obviously prioritized the capacity to capture that interior sonic soundscape of memory in the context of score. He does that especially vividly in a quite well-known work from 1906 called Central Park in the Dark, which was a companion to another well-known work which is often played in undergraduate music history courses called The Unanswered Question. And as we can see here in this program description, which he himself wrote, it purports to be a picture in sounds heard when sitting on a bench in Central Park on a hot summer night, some 30 years before the piece. In other words, when he was a college student. It's a well-known work. He, in fact, describes in the program the particular programmatic associations which the various musical elements are evoking: night sounds, the sounds of a casino, street singers, people singing marches or whistling marches, the sound of an elevated train, a street parade, a march, newsboys calling out for extras for special newspaper editions, mechanical pianos playing ragtime, and then, as often happens with Ives, some kind of climactic event, all captured in sound. So you can listen in your own leisure. I'll put this in the show notes. This piece, which is quite well known and is a fairly clearly programmatic piece. However, unlike the programmatic works of, say, Edward McDowell or even of Charles Tomlinson Griffiths with Tabasco, this work is far more abstract. There is a kind of floating sensibility of foregrounding and backgrounding. It's highly, highly, highly polytonal. It suspends rhythm, even as we can see in just a few seconds of this audio excerpt. And it is, in other words, not capturing precisely those sounds as they were, but rather more symbolically as he recalls them in his mind's ear. So this is the opening bars of Central Park in the Dark. Sorry that I have to cut that off, but I do urge you to listen to it in its entirety. It is in fact full of quotations, including that quote from a popular song, but they're highly abstracted, oftentimes by manipulating either the intervallic content of the borrowed melody or perhaps its rhythmic values, and then often juxtaposed against quite contrasted tonal orientations. A second piece I want to share, which is also a programmatic piece, which captures both Ives's interest in sound in the world and sound in the memory within the context of a kind of modernist musical idiom, but in a fashion which is deeply, deeply programmatic and in fact deeply patriotic. Comes from the second orchestral set from 1912, which is 3 unrelated movements, which is why it's a set. And this is the third, which is a piece with the quite lengthy title, "From Hanover Square North at the End of a Tragic Day, the Voice of the People was again was heard." And it commemorates a moment when a passenger liner called the Lusitania was sunk by a German submarine off the Irish coast, and it was experienced at that time as this horrific catastrophe which had been brought about by nefarious intent. There was an undeclared conflict going on between Britain and the rising Austro-Hungarian Empire at this time, and the Lusitania was sunk after being struck by a torpedo from a German U-boat. So the tremendous loss of life. We can see a screaming headline, an extra, in fact, from the New York Times on this event. And the reference is in Ives's programmatic title is not only to the Lusitania, but to something that happened to him as he was coming home from his insurance office in Manhattan, waiting at the elevated train, the elevated subway, on the day that the Lusitania was sunk. And he describes the event that precipitated this sonic recollection. He says, quote, "The morning paper on the breakfast table gave the news of the sinking of the Lusitania." And he describes going downtown and taking the L train at Hanover Square and a crowd waiting for the trains. And a barrel organ player began playing on the street below. And then people one after another began to join in, as we can see here, singing and whistling. And in this event, as Ives describes it occurring, which may or may not be strictly true, but seemingly was very influential, was very impactful for him, the people begin singing together. And even after the train comes in and they get on board, there are people still on board the train singing or humming the tune. And then he makes a point in the next paragraph that it wasn't a Broadway tune or a musical comedy or a dance tune or classical tune, but it was the refrain of a gospel hymn called "In the Sweet By and By." And he says that this was a kind of transcendent moment by the organ player, a man who was but giving out an experience, the experience of this tragic day of sorrow. And so Ives says that this third movement in the set is based on that tune and comes from that experience. And he makes use of something called cumulative form, which Peter Burkholder identified, in which the bits of the theme are heard throughout this very abstracted texture. And gradually, over the course of the movement, it coalesces more and more and more and more and more and more and more. And it's only heard in its fortissimo unison tutti audition at the end of the movement, this cumulative form, because in fact, Ives is reaching for a kind of transcendent apotheosis of experience, to take individual experience, individuated experience of many people who are individually reflecting upon and even sounding this tragic day, and then coming together in this gospel hymn. So we'll hear just a bit of the beginning and then a bit of the end. So I don't want to speak over that track, but I urge you to listen to the whole of the movement, because what Ives has done is to capture what he remembers this moment of community emotion and world sound occurring. He does not try to capture it in conventional musical language. Obviously, it's not in a specific tonal center. There is not a clear pulse because he doesn't recall this sound experience occurring in that fashion. He is reaching for a more universal, more inclusive definition of what a concert music can be. So I've suggested that Ives has been conventionally understood as separate from a different, far more modernist tradition than from the members of the Boston Classicists, who were his almost exact contemporaries. That's partly because Ives was only discovered or rediscovered after his active compositional career had essentially ended. He had health problems, and after 1921, he did almost no new composition, even though he lived until 1954. In fact, what he mostly did was to go back to old scores and revise them. And he often revised them to make them more dissonant or experimental than they had been when he first sketched them. And there's a reason for that. It has to do with his rediscovery. From 1929 onward, Ives anonymously funded Henry Cowell's journal publishing scores of new music called New Music. Eventually, Ives' own music appeared in that journal as well. He was the principal investor, although he kept that support anonymous because he was far too private a Victorian for to do otherwise. Nicholas Slanimsky conducted a wonderful set called Three Places in New England in the 1930s. John Kirkpatrick, the keyboardist, edited and then finally performed Ives' remarkable Concord Sonata, which is based in 4 movements, which are portraits of 4 different transcendentalist philosophers. Schoenberg once said, is reputed to have said in 1944 in a private diary note, there is a great man in American composition and his music is not well known, and he has solved so many of the problems that I myself sought to solve. And he was speaking of Ives. John Kirkpatrick and Helen Boatwright made the first recording of Ives' song repertoire, which he had self-published in a collection called 114 Songs in 1917. Lou Harrison, subsequently very influential as a so-called minimalist composer, conducted Symphony No. 3, The Camp Meeting in 1946, which is a programmatic work about an evangelical worship service in the open air, and that piece was awarded a Pulitzer in 1947. So it bears repeating. And then Leonard Bernstein conducted the Symphony No. 2, premiered the Symphony No. 2 on radio in 1951. So it's a rather unusual kind of compositional arc. Ives was trained in music by noted aestheticians of the Boston Classicist School. He had an avenue toward a career as a public composer and music teacher, music university professor. He declined that and opted to make his fortune instead. He claimed that this was because he didn't want his children to starve to death on his dissonances. He claimed that he had more compositional freedom because he was not trying to make a living as a composer, but made his living elsewhere. And the rediscoverers, the Cowells and Kirkpatricks and Bernsteins, largely bought that. They wanted to find in Ives a self-created, uniquely American musical genius who could be the father figure for an American national school, not beholden to Europe. And in fact, because Ives had labored for so long in obscurity, and by the time he was rediscovered by Henry Cowell and then Slanimsky in the late 1920s, he was no longer composing. And so Ives essentially decided that he would occupy the persona that these younger advocates discovered for him. And he was promulgated for the next 50 years, literally all the way up until the American bicentennial in 1976, as a great rough-hewn, self-taught American genius, the father of American modernist and nationalist composition. But in fact, he came from very much a similar social class and university training as the members of the Boston Classicists. He went another way, and in going another way, he preferred to remain somewhat in obscurity, to stay out of the competitive nature of seeking a career as a public composer. And so when he was rediscovered, he was an appropriate palimpsest, an appropriate blank slate upon which these younger American nationalist composers, often experimental, could project what they wanted to find. In about the last 15 to 18 years, there's been a bit of a revision to that myth, and it's a valuable revision, which I think in no way erodes the value of what Ives contributed and the scope of his achievement. Most notably by J. Peter Burkholder, whose dissertation was in fact turned into two books. First, Charles Ives, The Ideas Behind the Music, which is about Ives's family and intellectual background, what he did and didn't get from the transcendentalist philosophers, the ideas that shaped how Ives's music, the what should music do part of the question. And then a subsequent publication, which came out almost 10 years later, a much bigger book, which is an exhaustive investigation of how Ives used borrowed material and the ways in which that borrowed material not only quoted, but also evoked a sound world, and the ways that his experimental treatments of that borrowed or imitative or elusive material yielded the kind of experimental and highly individualized musical textures of something like From Hanover Square North. An edited collection which kind of summarizes the scope of Ives scholarship in the 1990s. Another edited tradition, another edited collection, I should say, which really captures the realization that was happening in the 1990s that Ives's music was far more indebted to the classical tradition than the mythographers or Ives himself had wanted to claim. And then finally, a very, very, very recent publication from 2021, another in Burkholder's series of books on Ives, Listening to Charles Ives, and an examination of his influence upon other composers. A second musicological author I want to cite here is Gail Sherwood McGee, who has done a remarkable job of helping to revise the myth. And what McGee did was to go back to what was actually said to and by and about Ives during his lifetime, prior to his rediscovery, along with an exhaustive re-examination of his music manuscripts, many of which had never been engraved, and tracing the provenance of the particular collections of paper and the status of his handwriting to try to establish when a work was written versus when it might have been revised versus when it might have been revised again. It's an enormously complicated job, which is ongoing, but it has allowed us to revise the myth of Charles Ives and to suggest that So as I was saying, and in conclusion, the fact that Ives diverged in his career from the experience of the Boston Classicists, the fact that he chose to enter business, that he chose to stay out of active participation in the aesthetic and musical debates of the late 19th century up to the First World War, the fact that subsequent mythographers chose to project upon him the American iconoclast, self-made, entirely experimental, entirely anti-Eurocentric composer they hoped to find, and even the fact that he himself accepted that projection should in no way take away from his accomplishments or the accomplishment of any composer. Like any composer, Ives looked around him at the circumstances in which he found himself, the support which was available or unavailable for the music that he wanted to write, and he made a series of decisions that, in his estimation, maximized his chances of artistic success, which is what any composer does. And so the fact that he was not the entirely self-created, entirely anti-Eurocentric, entirely ultra-modernist composer that Bernstein and Cowell and Lou Harrison and Aaron Copland wanted to find should in no way take away from his achievement. It should simply remind us that all artists are artists within the contexts and the demands and the opportunities of their historical moment. Thank you very much.